Hi folks, you're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the Statue of Liberty, the inscription upon it, the background to that inscription, and how it's used for blatant and disgraceful propaganda purposes today. The minute there's any talk about restricting mass immigration to qualified people or anything like that, there's someone, oh yeah, what about the Statue of Liberty? Give me your poor tight huddled masses. What about that motherfucker? Nazi. So let's just sort of have a little bit of a history lesson on this. What the poem, that's part of the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired huddled masses and breathe the free air and the golden door, all that sort of bullshit on that poem. That sentiment was expressed over 150 years ago and in very different times and circumstances, but we'll come back to that in a minute, how that should be applied and used as a blunt instrument to beat people over the head with as soon as immigration is even mentioned. There's even the slightest restriction, complete mass immigration. Anybody who wants to can come at any time for any reason, regardless of their ability to contribute or to work or to do anything at all. And that the tiniest limitation on total mass movement of people is, oh yeah, what about the inscription? What are you going to say about that, you fucking Nazi? So how the two are related is quite beyond me, but it's used by, during the first Trump administration, there was one of the, might have been Stephen Miller actually, but one of the Trump team was talking about limiting immigration to skilled people who had skills that were needed in the economy. And one of the, CNN or one of the MSNBC, one of the Globus controlled activist propaganda outfits then started reading the inscription of the Statue of Liberty. Yeah, what are you going to say about that? As if it was some kill shot or something like that. So let's go back now to the Statue of Liberty being put up in, now we're talking, the period 1870, 1880s here for the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island in New York Harbor. New York at that stage was the primary port of entry for people coming from, Europe or the greater European landmass into the United States, and there were the immigration facilities and so on there. And I think Ellis Island was actually the ones, and the Statue of Liberty was on anyway. So that was the main point of entry, and so the Statue of Liberty being put there, I guess, made sense. Now, in terms of its perceived interpretation at the time, and liberty today, they're two very different interpretations, and it is being used and massaged for political propaganda purposes, probably even, much more so today than it was at the time. But it was at the time, the Statue of Liberty was hijacked by activists, and that long shadow lives with us today. Now, during the 1860s, 70s, 80s, around there, and even earlier than that, the 1850s, there are a series of what were called revolutions in Europe, the 1848 revolutions and so on. And this, to some extent, changed the political map of Europe. The French king got kicked out, and in fact twice. And in 1830 and 1848, there was the various political reforms going on in Britain, which were certainly changing the face of the political landscape in Britain. Changes also across, what later would become infederating Germany and in Italy and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were various convulsions going on there, and in Russia as well. Now, Russia was probably the most tightly controlled, feudal serf society at the time. So the unrest in Russia and the areas that Russia controlled, such as Ukraine and so on, parts of Poland and the like, These were viewed by the Czarist administration of the day with some deep concern and anxiety, and their secret police profiled the sort of people that were causing the main trouble, and they were primarily Jewish activists. And so the Russian administration of the day, the Tsarist administration, took the view that if we get rid of these Jewish activists, the problems will go away. Now, they didn't really. They certainly lessened, but they just took a different shape. And the Jews that weren't activists, when other Jews were kicked out, later on became activists. So it was a problem that just didn't go away with one expulsion. And these expulsions of Jews, and these are practicing Jews, from the wider or greater Russian Empire, all the Russias, as they called it at the time. These people were expelled, and most of them, and depending on whose numbers you look at, there's between 2.5 and 3 million Jews were expelled from the greater Russian Empire between 1860 and 1895, maybe even a little bit earlier than, say 1855 to 1895, that 40 years. About 3 million is really what appears to be the most reliable estimates. And most of them went to the United States, particularly around New York and, that northeast area of the United States. And the trauma, if you like, of their expulsion and integration to the United States still stay. I remember sitting down having meals and business discussions and talks and breakfasts and lunches and dinners with Jews or descendants of Jews that were expelled from that time, and the rawness of their disquiet at that episode still is with them today, the descendants, and you can see how that frantic sort of screams and cries of Nazis are everywhere and Hitler and you can see how it's still raw and running with them today, and how they reach for it at a moment's notice, even though, again, it was more than 150 years ago, these events, that the pogroms, the expulsions from Russia. And Emma Lazarus, the author of the poem, that makes part of that inscription on the Statue of Liberty, "Give me a title of masses." She was a prominent Jewish activist. I mean, she wasn't just some casual Jewish activist that turned up, once every few months to the meeting. She was prominent. She was what today would be a screaming placard waver, and incensed at how they were treated. Now, given they were in a new country, the United States, given the new country, you think that all their energies and efforts would be put into integrating into the society. In fact, it wasn't. And if you read sort of other works and pamphlets and people that knew Emma Lazarus at the time, she was a radical activist, and you'd think the Tsar of Russia had personally kicked her out from Russia. So there was a degree of anger, irritation, defensive pugnacity, and so on, that was very much ran through everything, in my view at least, that Emma Lazarus did and wrote and said. And she was encouraged, I think, in this activism, and believed that the Jews should stick together as a very distinct group, practicing their faith and the kosher food and the whole 9 yards. And because of this determination to be different, act differently, and stick together totally as a group, they had what they perceived as discriminatory attitudes from the Gentiles, the Christian Gentiles around them, which in their view, rather than say, well, hey, we're acting and behaving and doing very differently, maybe that's part of the problem. But instead of that, they just wildly went in the other direction. This is the fucking Russian. This is the Russian Tsar all over again. It's all happening again. Here it is. Russian Tsars are everywhere. As in today, Hitlers are everywhere. But back then, it's Russian Tsars are everywhere. And they're all trying to get us. They're going to kick us out. Disaster. So we have to sort of get ahead of the curve, very much as the attitude they have today. And so this poem, "Give Me a Title Masses," was very much part of the Jewish view at the time in New York, that as long as the immigration policies are broad and vast and wide and can encompass anybody at any time coming from anywhere, because a lot of these Jews didn't speak English. They had to get out of Russia pretty quickly, and they were invited to leave, or told to leave, as the case may be, and therefore they had to move quickly, and so they couldn't necessarily prepare to speak English. Going to America, that is, they couldn't necessarily prepare to speak English if you had a bit more time. Not that the Jews aren't bright, hardworking, industrious. Many of them are, and many of the Jews I've met are exceptionally bright. I wish I was that clever. So they came to New York, or came to the United States, into New York, and most of them did stay in New York, and some of them did okay, some not so much, but many did all right. Many got into, later on got into, say, the newer industries like movie making, for example. So Hollywood and the like. So Emma Lazarus wrote this poem, which was, I don't know why it was ever agreed to put it on the Statue of Liberty. I mean, did they pay a bribe to somebody? I mean, how was it put there? But the view of the Jews at the time was the other Jews may need to leave Russia. Again, the Tsar was the bogeyman back in the day, like Hitler is today. Jews are going to need to leave Russia. So we have to make sure that the door is open to everybody, because we say you can only have the door open for Jews to immigrate. That's not going to fly. So we have to say that anybody can emigrate. And the Jews that applied to go to other countries in Europe, coming out of Russia, go to other countries, and not many of them were being accepted. And this they viewed as a huge danger. So, well, what if we're evicted or being evicted and other countries don't want us? Again, many went to the United States. So the idea is the Statue of Liberty to become a symbol as anybody at any time from anywhere can come for any reason to the United States as an immigration policy, which was seen as the best protection for the Ashkenazi Jews needing to move from one place to another, whether it was from Russia or anywhere else. And this was where, if you look at Emma Lazarus' writing, she viewed that sort of straight white Gentile Christians were the real danger, and so we have to prevent those straight white Gentile male Christians from making and formulating immigration policy, because if we leave it to them, they'll restrict it. And if they restrict it, Jews will be restricted as a natural byproduct of those restrictive policies, immigration policies. So we need to sort of somehow prevent that. And so this poem, or part of it, and other writings were seen very much as part of this. The Statue of Liberty has to represent a moral position rather than an actual policy. And in that, they were incredibly successful, because even today it's getting bandied around as a reason why anybody should come to the United States at any time. Now, people in third world countries, who have, absolute failed states and shithole places, I've spoken to many of them, again, traveling the world many times over on business, or even talking to people that have come to Australia and elsewhere. Their view is that people from poor countries should be allowed to go to rich countries whenever they want to, for any reason, no matter what. They believe that should happen. But we say, well, what about people going to your country? No. So they see it as a very one-way thing. And this is a poor country sort of malaise here, where, for example, you say to people from Israel, well, why don't you take a lot of, Chinese and Indians and Arabs and so on into your country, so that Jews become a minority there? No, we can't have that. Well, why do you want it for? It's different if it's your country. So the Gentile countries Christian Gentile countries are being slated for eradication or subversion to the point of eradication. And you can see this sentiment being expressed in the 1870s, 1880s in New York by the Jewish diaspora there, who believed that it was the best protection for mass movement of Jews around the world at any time, because we may, and you can see this in Emma Lazarus and the Confederates, the way they talk is, and the way they communicate with each other is, we may need to move at any time for any reason. Now let's come back to and therefore we have to make sure that the Gentile countries, which are the places we want to go to, have these open door immigration policies. Now, coming back to the Tsars, now the Tsars, the Tsarist administration, this is in Russia and the territories that Russia controlled, they had the view, and the secret police and the legal sort of infrastructure there, when they looked at every uprising, all the stirring, all the troublemaking, all the political activism, they, their analysis was that pretty much at every time it involved Jews and, Jewish activists with heavy Marxist type leanings. Bear in mind that I'm not sure Das Kapital, Karl Marx's seminal work, had actually been brought out at this time. I think the first volume had been, but I think the subsequent volumes that were yet to be published. But there was the Communist Manifesto and all sorts of various activists, what we call today communist Marxist literature, where, whether you want to look at Hegel or at others that were, or even going back, to the French Revolutionary times, looking at Rousseau and so on. There was definitely a Marxist, very strong Marxist angle, communist, socialist angle to this Jewish activism. Bear in mind, if you look at even the Jewish kibbutz structure or the Jewish view that everyone is equal, as in equity, everyone is equal, then we, the Jews, will never be persecuted because everyone's equal. Why would you persecute anybody if everyone's equal? And so there was this fantasy of a utopia that the Jews imagined that would somehow give them a form of moral protection that straight Gentile Christianity couldn't or wouldn't, or the rule of law couldn't or wouldn't. So you see this in their activism. So the Russians, quite reasonably and accurately, as the same way the FBI did 50 years later, so, okay, let's have a look at all the troublemakers. They're nearly all Jews. So if we get rid of the Jews, we get rid of the troublemakers. Now, it wasn't quite that simple or straightforward, but it wasn't an unreasonable position to come to. Now, on the other side, you can say, well, Russia was really, as in, and again, the wider sort of Russian-controlled territories, it was a feudal sort of serf type structure. Even when serfdom was officially sort of dispensed with, it's still the overhang still remained. So the Jews wanted reform to a greater level of equity and wealth distribution and so on. And now, whatever you think the moral position was or wasn't on that, it didn't mean that they weren't at the forefront of all the activism and the stirring and the troublemaking and the bombings and so on. They were. And if you look at, say, the writings of Leon Trotsky, the most prominent Jewish member of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and his attitudes as to how an equitable socialist society could be achieved, he was ruthlessly prepared to accept any collateral damage in terms of millions of lives lost, provided the ideology was successfully implemented, which remains today. You look at the globalists today; they're quite prepared to accept huge collateral damage to all the institutions, legal and other, financial and otherwise, provided they get their supposed just around the corner utopia, which is never going to materialize, by the way, and the destruction they'll wreak on the rest of us as they pursue this mad ideology. And that's something we're still working through. And President Trump is the only opposition to that in the world today. So coming back to the expulsion of the Jews was quite, it was reasonable under the circumstances. Any state will say, well, look at all these troublemakers. We got to expel them. In the same way today that anyone that speaks out against mass migration is viewed as an enemy of the state and has to be censored and debanked and made financially destroyed and so on. That's the same sort of factor that we see today. That we never thought it would happen in a situation where the government were representatives of the people, but the globalists have subverted that, so that our political establishment are just globalist employees and flunkies and stooges. But coming back to the Russian thing, though, it wasn't unreasonable for the Russians to say, well, this is the main group that causes trouble, we'll evict them, and those were the pogroms. But to the Jews on the other side, they were outraged by this, and that outrage simmered and still simmers today, by the way, in the United States. And that was the genesis to the Emma Lazarus poem, that was put on the Statue of Liberty. You've been a Tacitus today, you're a Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.